Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Oxford Conservatives podcast, where we will be discussing globalisation. So, Josh, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you, Archibald. How are you?
I'm doing splendidly, thank you. Yes. We're now in Lent, hence why we've moved off the alcohol and into I'm drinking some variety of tea of a herbal nature. I think it's lemon and ginger today,
Yes,
which
indeed.
makes a change from, I suppose, port.
Yes.
Yes. Anyway, yes, Josh, what is globalisation?
Well, I think globalization is quite a broad definition, and there's a lot of ways you could look at it. But I think, briefly put, it's the process of increasing connectivity and dependence among different nations and countries through the world, which include, I guess, economic, cultural, technological, and political exchanges. And in some sense, the conclusion, what it leads to is that there's a global spread of ideas, goods, services, and technologies. But of course, it does raise some concerns of, well, how do cultures interact with each other? What does it leave with, or what's the impact on economic inequalities, and also the impact on local job markets and dependence of countries? And we'll be discussing those in today's video.
Yes. I suppose we've ensured we've at least got some level of debate here. We have our guest book on, who will be providing, I suppose, I do hope he speaks very, very loudly at us, which I suppose, how are you doing, Mr. Book? It doesn't seem to be doing much, but anyway, it's a defence of globalisation. I suppose I'm I suppose these days rather a large critic to some extent of globalisation. I don't think it benefits us particularly well, especially this economic globalisation that we have of generally the integration of a national economy into that of a globalised market-based system, where really the own import-export of a country is not overly much concern. And I think that is an especially prescient and concerning point of our economic system, especially as we're moving into a sort of more fractured world, which isn't perhaps so cooperative. It still depends on itself and each other very much in this independence model you discuss. Especially, for example, that of energy. The energy market's very much concentrated in perhaps in Russia, the Stans, and the Middle East, and we're heavily reliant on them to have energy. I mean, saw what happened when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, when the natural gas prices went absolutely through the roof. The crude oil prices went very, very high per barrel. It broke above 150, I think, dollars a barrel, which is quite impressive. It was a great rally. And it showed the vulnerability of having a globalised energy system, this energy market. And it's interesting to discuss that in sort of contention with this idea of a cultural level of globalisation. So I was wondering, Joshua, what are your thoughts on the perhaps trend of globalisation that's been happening across the world?
I think a lot could be said about globalization, and perhaps I'm less of a critic than you are. Perhaps because of the very fact that I'm currently in the UK and I'm studying
Yes,
here.
I
So
suppose
if I
so,
was
yes.
a critic of globalization, I'll perhaps be a critic of my very existence in the UK. Though at the same time, I do share some concerns, and great concerns, about globalization, especially from the perspective of cultural exchange, and perhaps more particularly certain cultural elements which have been rising within Hong Kong, which would not have been so if it wasn't for the rise of globalization through social media, through popular culture, and the sort which is one of those aids of globalization. And of course, globalization is a phenomenon which began before the widespread use of social media. But nonetheless, I think from a cultural perspective, more importantly, a cultural perspective, it has indeed risen so strongly because of almost the constant access that people have to global culture and to ideas on Instagram, on YouTube, on TikTok perhaps, which are all, I think, quite interestingly, controlled by certain ideologies or certain groups of people with a certain mindset, which then dictates and helps dictate what a majority of the people interact with on a daily basis. And that, to me, is perhaps an area of concern when I do approach globalization from that cultural landscape. And I'm sure we'll delve into that a bit more, but I guess that's kind of a broad summary of my thoughts on it.
Well, I suppose this trending globalisation on the cultural landscape, especially on social media, I think it's more of an Americanisation, trending globalisation, where America propagates. I mean, it's a massive exporter of most things cultural these days. It exported the culture wars over into Europe, as we've seen. I know some dispute this notion of culture wars, but I think the level of contention and divide in cultural issues has certainly grown. And it's exported, I suppose, the rather awful institutions of a McDonald's or perhaps KFC, or a vast myriad of American fast food chains that have certainly got across the world. And I think social media, in this sense, does play a large part into it. It's usually American ideas that get propagated. I think, in some sense, social media could have been a large catalyst for going back into one's nation to propagate one's own nation across the world, showing the elements of perhaps the British identity. I think it's made us more homogenous in some sense, because we're not now too far away from someone in America. So we like to sort of assimilate and become very much the same. It's like if we have a school, for example. No one wants to necessarily feel out of place. They all want to fit in. So suddenly they all become one homogenous body, and every school child wishes to have a certain type of bag, or wishes to wear a certain type of clothes at home, or have a certain type of phone, and so on. There's this need to feel acceptance. And I think it's gone now into this global stage that we see. I'm interested to hear, what perhaps do you think, as you were from Hong Kong, what do you think has impacted Hong Kong in globalisation, especially in perhaps the cultural side?
I think from a cultural side, globalization has been a very dangerous aspect of Hong Kong culture, especially with the rise of Western influence, foreign influences like partying, promiscuity, which we discussed in our last episode, homosexuality as well, LGBTQ movements. These things have grown so much in Hong Kong purely because of, I would say, the globalization, the impact of globalization on our culture, because of course China is or is a culture which really wants to keep to the conservative movements and conservative ideologies, especially under Confucianism. So the rise of these ideas, these perhaps Western ideas within our Hong Kong culture and also in China in extension, and these movements are growing in China, like homosexuality, and of course promiscuity, and these things are growing in China. But why I guess I'm trying to say is that the American, I guess, influence on Hong Kong has been extremely prevalent, and it's very important that we try our best, I think, to try to fight against these influences of cultural change.
I guess it's especially interesting in terms of Hong Kong, because I suppose the cultural change is not necessarily done through, perhaps as we see in Britain or in Europe, and especially in America, of ways of immigration, because the demographics still generally relatively Hong Kong, native Hong Kong, native Chinese. So I think in this sense, there has to be a different catalyst, that of a new culture propagated, perhaps again in our films and our books, and especially now the social media sort of explodes in that case, where we almost are appealing to this Western culture. And it's a great shame, because a lot is lost. I suppose we lose, even in Britain, we lose the sense of the old British culture from, it sounds awfully, I suppose, folky, but the Morris dancing, the maypole dancing, it still exists in the countryside. There's still a sense of the British nation. But if you go to the cities now, for example, in London, it's very traditional to have your pie and perhaps mashed potatoes and jellied eel, but they're becoming increasingly far down on the list in favour of a great plethora of multicultural places, which then lose in itself the innate cultural ability of one place. For example, if we have a set of multicultural places, let's say Japanese food, Japanese is multicultural, we're multicultural, America's multicultural. If we were to import Japanese food, because it would be multicultural, the Japanese food would again be multicultural, be no different to your own food, because again, it's a very homogeneous mix. If you have a great variety of, I suppose, paint blotches on an artist's, I've forgotten the name for it, where they mix the paints. I'm sure everyone knows what I mean. You know, you see them, the classical caricatures of an artist, where they wear the beret, and obviously French, and have these oils on their mixing palette tray. And if you mix them all together, they make one colour. But it's sometimes more beautiful to have colours of the different pockets of culture all spread out and all with their own sense of identity. I think it's something more greater even when visiting, where you visit a culture and it's entirely different to your own, and it's a marvellous thing. We're not, I think, downplaying here the wonder of cultural difference, but it's ensuring the difference still exists. I think globalisation, especially with the American trends, likes to get rid of it and make it into one sense of here is what you should aspire to. The American dream is the pinnacle of life.
Now that raises an interesting question of, I guess there's a very stereotypical view of Chinese media, but this is something I think China does very well. There is a very strong censorship, perhaps, of what foreign influences, especially of a social and cultural landscape, of films, ideas that can be imported into China. For example, a lot of movies are banned if they depict Chinese in a very poor light. Many movies are banned if they demonstrate values which are perhaps anti-China or anti-Confucianism, for example. And a good example of that is like a lot of Marvel movies or Disney movies currently are constantly getting banned because of the rampant amount of homosexuality in them. They're getting removed, and in some sense, I think that's quite a good thing. I quite like it. But at the same time, of course, there's a question of, well, surely that goes against our intuitions of freedom of speech. But nonetheless, do you think it is the case that we've gotten into a world where all these big social media companies or all these cultural influencers are so controlled by, I guess, American ideal or American movements that the only way to stop American globalization, American, I guess, propagation is to have a strong hardline stance against it, to say we will not let your cultures take advantage and become the only culture which is being taught in our films and social media and such?
Well, I certainly think there is a necessity to take a stand against it. If you have a single dominant power, especially, well, I suppose there isn't really a single dominant power because some places, China, for one example, rejects this idea of American imperialism. Russia does much the same to some extent. And if we are to allow this, I think it comes from really the critical social justice movement, these ideas being propagated within Hollywood films, within our social media trends, on what is censored and what is not censored on social media. It puts forth a very single view of the world, that we must have a diverse world. We must have a world that is woke in the pejorative sense. And anything that isn't there gets censored. So it's quite interesting. It has an history of censorship, because in itself the media that's being put out is inordinately sanitized, and it's sanitized to fit a certain agenda, as I suppose before things were sanitized to fit a certain agenda. But the point is now, I don't agree with the agenda at all. I don't agree with what is being propagated. And I don't even think it has any semblance to a national culture. If I watch a movie from which is now produced in Hollywood, it's no different to most movies that are propagated in large box offices around the world. You have to now watch really the independent film producers, perhaps somewhere in France, in the middle of nowhere, or in Germany or Eastern Europe in the middle of nowhere. You get something that has a flavour of something different, that hasn't had this big level of almost Hollywood exposure. And even if you go into sort of the Eastern Europe, because it was closed off for so long, I think, with communism, it didn't have such a large uptake of the American exports as we saw post World War II, when we started to adopt all of these American cultural impositions. May that be the American beliefs on social issues, the hippie movements in the 60s, to even the race wars that got exported entirely, where it wasn't really a problem in Britain. We had Indians study in Britain when the British Empire was on in the 1920s, and they were there. Again, there are obviously a few cases where they weren't treated very well, but generally when they came over to study, to then go back to India and give back to their country, they were treated, and there's many anecdotal evidence of them being treated very politely and in accordance, because they're in a different culture. We accept people in a different culture, in the sense that, yes, there is this level of cultural exchange where we say we'll take in these Hollywood films, we'll watch them, but we won't make them our films. We won't make them our identity of the culture. I think there's a line there that needs to be drawn from recognising a difference in a culture, and perhaps looking at it and enjoying it, but not bringing it in to replace one's culture. I think that's the key difference, of not replacing what one has for something new.
I think you touch on numerous interesting points there, and I think having a diverse exposure to different ideas is definitely a helpful one, perhaps. Though I think the line where I'm more concerned with is I guess the agenda under which globalization is being purported or pushed. They say we want a diverse world, we want people to interact with each other. But then I guess the definition, I think, and here we need to be very nuanced, is ideal diversity is itself it's almost subject to equivocation, because when we're saying we want a diverse world, a lot of people have the idea of the woke idea of saying, well, a diverse world is one in which we have a lot of different people equally loving and respecting each other and having a lot of open opinions, and that sounds all good. But then they bring in their ideas of, a diverse world is also one which accepts homosexuality, one which accepts and loves non-nuclear family, all these different views of society, these social and political views. But when you actually look at it, a lot of cultures are thoroughly against such views, and to truly have a diverse world in some sense, in its most strictest definition, I would say, a diverse world is one in which there are some countries which disagree with such cultures, and to respect that some countries may disagree with them. And that, I think, is perhaps a higher form of diversity, which is something which we have to strive towards, and not one in which diversity is only used under the definition of one worldview, because that would just be the propagation of one certain culture instead of a promotion of numerous different worldviews and cultural identities. I was wondering what your thoughts are of that.
Well, I think it is almost it's quite ironic that a diverse world is not actually a world which is diverse, because if everyone is innately accepting, I'm not really sure one can form any proper identity. But I think acceptance is not necessarily the best thing. If we're to say we must be diverse and in that sense have acceptance, we must then also accept the people who don't want to be diverse and don't wish to accept. But diversity doesn't allow for that. It is acceptance only so far as you accept and you agree to accept everyone else. And I think that's where it becomes quite ironic, because it preaches acceptance, but it is intolerant of the intolerance. You should be, if you're tolerant, you should be tolerant of it all, not tolerant of a select few. And it's also tolerant of things that are morally abhorrent to some extent, if followed out to the logical conclusion. And being the sense of a diverse world is ironic in some sense, because it's usually talking about diversity within the Western sort of Northern Hemisphere, where I think ironically it is the minority in the world population, and yet it wants it to be diverse, and it must be diverse, and it must accept other cultures, and it must have everything but its own culture. I think that's the interesting point. And when one wishes to point out one wants one's own culture, one is often called perhaps a xenophobe or a racist or something like that. And it's quite ironic, because one can say at the same time, and they're quite easy to hold both views, I have my culture, I enjoy my culture, I live inside my culture, I embrace it. But you know what? My culture is in equal footing of a culture in Africa. I suppose in some sense I'm not sure. I believe the Christian culture is the culture to strive for and is the ultimate end. But I can respect someone else's different culture, and they can keep it there, and I have my culture. I see nothing wrong with that, because you can go into their country, you can embrace their culture, you can explore their culture, and they can do the same to you. But there's at no point this need where I must enforce my culture on someone else, and they must enforce it on me. And even within this diverse mindset, they perhaps would say, but it's fine, Mr. Elliot, it's absolutely fine. You can have your culture, and we can have ours. We can live in a hodgepodge, in a mess. And in that sense, I think we lose it to some greater or less extent, because a culture needs a great amount of persons to maintain and upkeep the culture.
Do you think it's possible, however, to maintain that idea of I'll keep my culture to myself and you keep your culture to yourself in the modern world, just because of how connected we are? Because if you think back perhaps you don't even go back too long, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, I mean, a lot of countries that we see today haven't formed yet, and that's one thing. But also there's way less connection between different countries. A tribe in the middle of Africa might not necessarily need to be in direct contact with another tribe in Africa, or in America, for example, they will be independent. And in the same way, perhaps a tribe in the middle of the Amazon rainforest might be functioning very well. But the reason why they can remain independent and not require American influence is because they are completely separate from everywhere else in the world. They don't know about the external existence of the world, and as a result, they don't really need that access.
Well, it's interesting you pointed that, because I think for thousands of years there have been trade routes. There's been trading right across the continents. You see Middle Eastern shekels end up in Scandinavia.
Yes.
It's quite interesting how they transport because of trade. I think that's perhaps a nasty side of the Arab slave trade, that they did end up over into Scandinavia. So I think there's always been this mix in culture, the cultures knowing other cultures. But the interesting part is the cultures still maintain their own identity. I think purely for the foremost reason of you had the merchants who went out and traded, and different goods were brought back. But there wasn't a mass movement of people, nor a mass trading of ideas or awareness. So within perhaps a town in the middle of nowhere in England, you might now and again get an exotic traded good, or know of a trader and stories of them travelling to far and foreign lands. But there wasn't that innate connection between the large set of people in that place and a large set of people in another. And I think in that sense, we find it rather hard to do now. But I think it's entirely possible. I think it generally is, even though I have a knowledge of somewhere in China, I don't then suddenly lose my own culture. I think it's when we have then a large movement of people. We even hear Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary currently, and she said multiculturalism has failed Britain. I think it's this sense where it's not necessarily about race or ethnicity, although I think they have a role to play in culture. But it's the notion that if we have lots of cultures together, we very, very quickly lose a dominant culture or a sense of the culture when we walk into a place. It is merely a lot of different cultures all at once. And I think that's where the difficulty comes, when we have a lot of cultures all in one place and we don't really know where one belongs to.
Perhaps one of the reasons, you raised the idea of people didn't have that much awareness of other cultures, and that was one of the reasons why perhaps globalization not spread so strongly. Do you think it could be the case that today, since we have so much awareness, there is a natural inclination towards globalization just because we have so many different choices, and in some sense we're so spoiled by choice that a lot of people just decide, oh, I like this certain mindset that I get in America. I like the hippie movement, for example. Perhaps especially if someone's extremely impressionable and they're a teenager, they're like, all right, it seems like let's live and let everything happen, and therefore I'll just take on all these ideas of acceptance from another culture because I'm just aware of all these ideas.
I think that's one of the slight problems. There's little grounding, I suppose, in one's own culture. I suppose if someone is inordinately impressionable, they'll form whatever view is given to them. You could probably play quite a fun game of making them jump around sort of 50 viewpoints in a year, a different one each week, if they're indeed rather impressionable. And I suppose that is a downside. This is a great failure of our globalised world. I suppose we have to accept we are currently living in a globalised world. But if that's a good thing or not, it's a different matter. It can't be avoided, I suppose, if one has a lot of knowledge about other things and is impressionable, that one perhaps will indeed at some point start to adopt certain views.
So I guess what is the solution to that? How are we meant to fight against this idea of impressionability? Do you think it's the role of the parents who perhaps build one strongly as a child in their own culture, teach them about their cultural values, and then after that, after you have a strong grounding in one's own identity, to then be able to move on and interact with other cultures in a positive light, perhaps, based on that foundation?
Yes. It's much like as one of my music teachers once said to me, first afterwards, you should learn classical playing. And then if you want to eventually play jazz, you can do it. Because you have a strong grounding on what is almost the tradition, and a strong grounding in rather very much there, and then you can go and explore different things. You can always return to the strong grounding. But the slight problem is, if you learn a lot of different things, you have a bit of classical here, a bit of jazz, and you don't play jazz particularly well, you don't play classical particularly well, because you've adopted bits from each other that don't work well together. So in that sense, I think a strong grounding can be provided, certainly from parents. And if its strong grounding is indeed produced, we maintain the cultural fabric of a country. I think that's certainly one point. It's moving away from this space where we have very little grounding. And I think it's damaging to a person not to have a sense of belonging. Especially in this modern world, everyone is all about belonging. And they invent new things to try and make themselves feel like they belong. Certain communities, perhaps the LGBTQ community is one example, where they want to feel a belonging to something. And this idea and want for human belonging is very, very important. It's an innate human desire to have a sense of belonging. And I think we can easily provide that in the realm of the country, which I think is a lot less divisive than independent interest groups. If you have a sense of a nation and a sense of a common culture that I share with John, who lives next door, and Betty, who lives 5 streets down, or Francis, who lives about 2 towns and 40 miles across the country, and we have a shared set of a good culture, I think we feel a lot more unified as a people and have the sense of community where we can all sort of have something in common to get along. I'm not sure how you think on that.
I do think that's quite a good solution, because ultimately humans are herd group animals, and that's why Kierkegaard makes the famous argument that the herd is often the most cowardly, in the sense that we just attach ourselves to a certain group identity. But I do think there is some great value to that group identity, because that enforces us to recognize our own identity, our own tribe almost. And I think that's the same reason for why I guess ancestor worship, or at least ancestor respect in China, is such a strong thing, and why China perhaps holds so strong to their values is precisely because they're like, well, I am who I am, not only because of myself as an individual in China, but because I've been part of a very long line of Chinese people throughout history, and you could trace that back to certain perhaps key individuals in Chinese culture, tradition, in the area, the local area, and that connection, I think, is a very useful thing to have when you're trying to preserve your own identity. But perhaps we've talked quite a lot about, I guess, the dangers of cultural dialogue. Perhaps we could try to think about some perhaps benefits of this, or at least what are some good things which come out of it.
Well, I suppose there's an interesting benefit merely to learn about other cultures. I think that's the sole benefit. But I think once one starts to incorporate it, that's where we start to see it go too far, because we start to see it's all becoming rather similar. And I rather like the fact we have a diverse world and diverse cultures, where I am not the same as someone who lives perhaps halfway across the world. That we have a difference of traditions, we have a different set of cultural identity. And that's, I suppose, the interest there, of how we differ as humans. But I think that's probably the main benefit of a cultural dialogue. When it goes a bit too far and we start to become similar, or we start to assimilate, I think that's when we then face problems. I'm not sure how you think on the benefits.
I do think education is one of the key ideas. So I'm not sure exactly how education, I guess, I mean, it's nice, especially I love traveling. I go to different places, experience the different cultures, learn from the locals, and see how they go. And I think it does open up a new mindset to you. Though at the same time, I think there is, as I completely agree with you, from a cultural perspective, there's that great fear of just being so focused on learning new things that you then just don't stand for anything in some sense. And that's kind of a lack of a personal identity, perhaps.
Yes.
Now, I guess we could move on and discuss perhaps the kind of the technological or at least the economical dependence, because I think economical dependence is likewise a very important field when it comes to globalization, because not only are we thinking about the dangers and benefits of how different cultures and value systems interact with each other, but we're also thinking about, well, can countries be completely self-reliant in the modern world, and if so, how does that express, and what implications does that have on a society?
Well, I think countries used to be a lot more self-reliant to a greater or lesser extent. Britain used to grow most of its own food. And I think even there we have some level of a cultural diversity, where the diet in the Mediterranean you couldn't get if you were in Britain. You couldn't get if you were way up in Siberia. It simply wasn't there. There's again this diversity of diet. It's just all about it. Again, a diverse world. And I think now, because I can have perhaps the olives and the tomatoes and whatever, and the cheese all imported straight over on a plane from Italy, or from Greece, or from the south of France, or from Spain. In that sense, we get a wonderful benefit of this world. We can experience things at almost a click of a button. We can always just go to the shop and experience something that before would be rather hard to achieve. But I think it makes us become a lot less appreciative of it. And in that sense, it also makes us a lot more dependent, because very soon perhaps we grow tastes and we rather like this diet, and suddenly everyone likes this diet, and therefore everyone changes to it, and we then have a lack of production in our own country because we can't produce the certain food that people like to eat. And then if we hit, for example, in a wartime measure, or we hit a global inflationary crisis, a recession, we suddenly then start to struggle because we then can't produce our own food. And when we become so interdependent on each other, we start to collapse if one part fails. I suppose we saw an issue when Ukraine, which was a very, very large production of wheat, was then shut down. And they had to, I think Turkey managed to get Russia to agree to allow some grain ships to leave a port from the Black Sea, because otherwise an African country was going to starve because it imported its grain from Ukraine. So in this sense, we see the innate problems in our global supply chain, that if we can't produce the goods we require to consume inside our own borders, we can face large problems further down the line.
Very difficult to have your cake and eat it as well, in some sense. The benefits of having that intercultural exchange and also being able to experience different, economic benefits or different types of foods or whatever it is, right? You get the benefit from that, but almost the condition of that is that we do have a global supply chain. Though I'm not, and in some sense you could say, well, if you want one, then you must have the other. Though perhaps you could try to, I guess, take a more independent look at it and say, well, if we're looking at it from an individual government level, countries have almost should perhaps have a mindset where, okay, we can have certain amount of foreign imports, as long as we fundamentally have our personal imports being at a certain level first. And I can't remember exactly which country did this, but I'm quite certain that a country in the past, due to the inflationary prices, they said, okay, until our our local prices reach a certain amount of number, we will not import foreign goods. I think it was Russia, if I remember correctly. But
it used to be an ordinary standard.
Yes.
It was all about the trade balances, how much was going, how much we were importing, how much was exporting. It used to be a very talked about figure. Was it sort of a £2 billion this year difference or deficit? So it used to be much, much more important than it is now. Now it's barely talked about. We don't pay. I suppose none of us off the top of our head could name how much the UK exports versus how much it imports, because we've become immune to the problem. Before, we were rather more protectionist. Even the States does it to some extent in their trade wars. Trump benefited US-made goods, and he put a surcharge on anything that was made in China to some extent, which he at least attempted to, or stop Chinese companies from using American technology to boost the American industry. And I think it does work. I'm in favour of protectionist views. We have, for example, in the UK, Tata Steel, the steelworks in one of the ports in Wales, is going to cut 3,000 jobs. We have these massive cuts in the steel industry over the last sort of 10, 20 years. They've been going up and up and up. We've been losing so many jobs in the primary industries, where we still use a lot of materials, but now we're shipping them from halfway around the world. So even in the sense, if we accept climate change, which is again still debatable, but if we accept that, on an environmental level it doesn't make sense, but even on a cultural level it equally doesn't make sense, because a government has a duty to its people, to allow its people to be employed. And we've very much moved into a service industry that, to me, appears very much a Fugazi industry. It serves itself. You have company A that serves company B, that serves company C, that eventually serves back to company A. And it goes around in a circle over this idea where we produce things that are tangible. We produce tangible goods. I even think about it. When I was in very, very little in school, we used to have, I think it's studlets of pencils or something, the black and yellow pencils. Perhaps it's very pedantic. And they used to always be made in Great Britain, would be the embossed stamp on the pencil of where it was made in Great Britain. And then they started to change to Germany, and then they're made elsewhere. So it's very interesting. There's very little that I think is made in Britain these days that is on a large scale produced. We have obviously some of our ceramic workshops. They still Denby produce still a lot. We see even Waterford, Royal Dalton. They still exist and produce a lot. They're massively under threat from a globalised market. I think that's a shame, because we're seeing less of our goods produced in-house inside the country, which provides, again, more tax revenue for the worker. It provides good employment for the workers. It provides a sense of a pride, I suppose, that if you're making a good inside this country, perhaps you're on a car manufacturing line, you know you've made something tangible. There's a tangible aspect you've brought into existence. I'm not sure how, perhaps you feel, I suppose in Hong Kong sense, in China, they're on the opposite end. They produce an awful large amount of the world's goods, and they produce lots for themselves and are relatively self-sufficient.
So I think you raised multiple interesting points there, and perhaps we could talk about, I guess, you discussing how, I guess, more developed countries are becoming more of a service industry, and in some sense there's this element where in the past you have numerous different classes within a society of people working in industry. There'll be people working as solicitors, lawyers, or more kind of traditionally high-paying jobs perhaps, and you'll have numerous different classes arranged as such, but now you almost, instead of having different, perhaps, territories or different cities in a country which did those jobs, you now have different countries at large doing those jobs instead. So you'll have, I guess, wheat being produced in the Ukraine, certain, I guess, industries being created in China, certain resources, natural resources are being mined in Australia or whatever it is, right? Or food, certain things like lobsters are coming from Australia to China, and that's the only source of lobsters. And the result of such things is that you're completely eradicating certain classes from society. So there is an element where the lower class, there's not really that many lower class left, or room for a lower class left in certain areas. And Hong Kong is a very good example for that, because Hong Kong was very much, it's kind of reached its peak in the idea of construction and a lot of other aspects. And yes, there's still construction work going on, but that lower class aspect of Hong Kong is really, really being crushed out. And that's why you have so many people struggling, I guess, now with jobs and with affording anything, because housing prices have gone up. People in the lower class can't afford anything, and also they can't even find jobs to be lower class. And as a result, that class itself is getting really crushed out. And the middle class as well is slowly getting crushed out. And then you have a really large population of people which are highly educated, like university students, who are unwilling to do the lower class jobs when they arise, but then there's already too many people doing the middle class jobs and the higher class jobs within a certain country, because there is no room for those certain types of jobs and industries remaining.
But it's interesting you mentioned, would you say the construction of lower classes is a bad thing necessarily? If everyone is moving up?
Well, I think it is a bad thing. And this might be a very controversial take. But I'll say it is a bad thing precisely because it is impossible to have an economy or a country being run when you cannot have a country where everyone's a lawyer or everyone's a doctor or all these upper class jobs. And likewise, the problem is now everyone's getting sent to university, and everyone at university want to at least have a certain amount of jobs that they're willing to do. They don't want to clean the streets. They don't want to be a server at restaurants. And that's why if you go, I guess, while Britain was still in the EU, if you go to a restaurant, you'll see loads of servers from Romania or from Europe. But now, of course,
very few British.
Very few British. But now, if you say, well, okay, let's have globalization, or rampant globalization, you'd say, if it wasn't for the fact of the EU, you'd say, okay, let's put more of those jobs, let them be given to the people from other countries, and let's keep all the high-paying jobs ourselves, which is a very rational thing for a country to do. But the only result of that is, okay, assuming there is a problem where, I guess, UK leaves the EU, then now no one wants to do those jobs, no one's doing those jobs, and there's a massive problem in the industry and in the workforce. So I do think there's challenges when there is no lower class.
Yes, I suppose you do raise a fair objection there, that if there's not a sort of a stratus in society, we cease to function. And especially if we just give these jobs to the immigrants, I think it puts a heavy dependence on people having imported labour. Again, it's another, and they may indeed go back, and if they go back, well, we're rather stuffed. And it's interesting you mentioned that people moving away from perhaps the primary industries. I think it's especially happening in the UK. Even if you look at farming, the amount of farmers in the UK are decreasing. I mean, the government's putting awful policies in with land at the moment, wanting, I think, 25% of their land to be rewilded, which is the most astounding thing when you think, we all eat food. How does food get produced by farmers who utilise their land and don't produce massive environment? They're beneficial to the environment. And we wish to sort of get rid of their land. We get rid of our steelworks and most of the industry jobs. And I think we become rather empty. It's a downfall of a country when one only moves to a secondary sector. Yes, indeed, there is better pay, but in the same time, because there's better pay, there's also more unemployment. People demand better sort of services to be run in a different way. The tax burden goes up. So actually, I think everyone is then trapped. It's trapped in the sense of a high taxation system where one has to work or one cannot live. Even if you own a house these days, you still have to pay stuff to the government or the council every month or every year to keep your house. It's rather astounding. Nothing is actually owned in principle freely.
I agree with that. And perhaps we could talk a bit about the idea of giving jobs to immigrants, and this is a bit of a tangential point, though I do think there's this idea where I'm not sure whether giving jobs to the immigrants is itself a good idea, because although it's important to give certain jobs to the immigrants, from a more taking a step back, it can lead to ideas of racism, I guess, because if you have a certain group of people who only do who only drive taxis or only build constructions, and you just have the idea of, okay, those people are lower class, which I think is a very big challenge in Hong Kong. For example, we have a lot of Filipino helpers, and God bless their souls, they're wonderful and are very important for our economy. Then a result of that is, although those of older generations are able to respect them, to say, well, all right, it's great that you're coming to help us, we appreciate that help. You have newer generations who have just grown up with that all their lives, saying, okay, all Filipinos are helpers and second-class citizens, and we can treat them as such, which is, I think, a very racist and a very dangerous path to head down.
I think it comes within this globalized world of money is best. As in American export, in a greater or lesser sense, that money speaks. If I can afford it, I can do what I like. But it shouldn't apply that way. I think even we have the immigrant workers. I think that it's very important to a society. If you can't get the work in, you have to import it. Guernsey have an example where they very much struggled to get hospitality workers in. So they brought people over from the hospitality schools in Africa on 10-year contracts. So they come over, they work 10 years, and then they go back home. And they earn good money for their family back at home, which is their own culture. They're giving back to their community at home. They're sending most of the money back. And they then return afterwards. So I think it's a good system of exchange where they come, we pay them a very fair wage, and then they go back. And then we sort of have our own sense of identity and culture, and everything does then usually run relatively well. You can have, again, immigration to a small level extent. I'm not opposed to, but I think we also need to be recognised. I think in Britain that yes, these jobs aren't just for immigrant workers. It is an entirely honourable job. It is best to earn your money and not receive it as a benefit. I think there is something honourable in earning your living, not asking for a handout.
I think there's something really concerning there as well, because I guess walking through the streets of Oxford, you see a lot of homeless people around the streets. And one thing I always ask myself, especially for the men who are homeless in the streets, I ask myself, well, surely there are some jobs that they can do. And in some sense, I think there must be some jobs that they can do, which perhaps have been given to the immigrants instead.
Well, one would think there would be, but it's inordinately sad because we've moved away from all the primary industries where we could employ people without needing a CV, without needing qualifications, and we can employ them to work. And I think that's where the government is failing us, because the government could quite easily say, right, here we are, we're going to create some new industries, and anyone who wants to turn up, come along, and we can put you in some manual work. We can give you a job. We can give you a purpose, and we can help you build your life back. I see there's a great social aim of the government there, where the government can do it. It can still make a profit. It can still break even, and not lose any money, and yet provide a living for its people. And I think that's a great strand that's lacking in society, where we don't have government employment in that sense, where we can employ these people who perhaps wouldn't be able to work or couldn't get a job or couldn't find a job. And then I think it's quite simple. You can work or you don't get paid. There's this level of, there's an expectation you work some hours and you get paid for those hours, you get a house and so on. And it can entirely be done alongside that of private industry. They're not two mutually exclusive zones.
Completely agree with that, and I think that perhaps is one of the further dangers from an economical standpoint of globalization, because not only are we talking about, I guess, the interdependence, because of course, as you touched upon, the kind of the challenges which arose from the Ukraine and the Russo-Ukrainian war was precisely that area of well, all right, we were so dependent on Russia for certain resources and Ukraine for certain resources that when something happens there's now a very big problem. The same goes down to the idea of, well, all right, even internally in a country, the industries are fundamentally struggling, which leads ultimately to a kind of a jobless population. And I think in Spain, that's specifically a very big challenge, because a lot of students who've gone to university, they don't want to work at those jobs, so they're unwilling to work below themselves. And then as a result, they just end up being jobless, and then that leads to problems of itself in some sense. But
I think the slight problem is we're now no longer competing merely on a national market.
Yes.
Everything is being competed on this international market. It's this economic globalisation of the integration of the national economy into that of the international, where my manufacturing plant down in the southwest, I don't have one, but as an example, hyperbolic example, they now have to compete with a factory in Tianjin in China, who can get the workforce who would work, at the rates they want to pay, and they can make the product for a cheaper price to, again, it's relatively similar quality. Especially now, I think China's greatly improved in its quality control. But my company in Southwest, well, I'm restrained by government. I must pay the workers. Obviously, you have to pay the workers. You have to pay the workers so much. You have to pay the taxes on X, Y, Z. And you're competing with a product that can be imported from China. And there's no protectionism involved. And I think that's where we used to differ in the 1920s. There used to be this, or even before then, it used to be the big aim to have protectionism in play. We saw it with before the Indian independence with the Manchester cotton men, or rather the Lancashire cotton mills. They were competing with these. They would be competing with these mills in India, and they weren't happy about it to a greater or lesser extent because they could not produce it at the same price, and their industry would be massively threatened. That's, I suppose, why nowadays we don't see much fabric being produced in this country. Lots of the cotton mills all shut down because we're now competing on this global scale. And the government before had export and import controls to prevent a great swathe of international cotton overflowing and corrupting and overthrowing British industry. And we still see it in some countries around the world, but it's increasingly rare. And I think that's, again, another downside of this economic globalisation, where we can no longer have our own industry because we have to compete with the global market. And in turn, it leads to the social and cultural problems of vast swathes, perhaps of unemployment, or working in jobs that are very menial, rather than a purposeful form of employment.
And perhaps we will discuss the theme of nationalism in another episode, though I do think there is this idea where globalization has arisen, and one now must ask, well, what is the natural response to it? Yeah. And you talk about, I guess, the Chinese exports in comparison to, I guess, British products. And one thing that I think about, I mean, as someone who's quite proud of China as a whole, there's always that question of, well, if a country can indeed export their culture or export their products in a way, what's stopping them from actually going to do it? Because, I mean, as much as I want to complain about American domination of social media, of cultural changes, I would likewise be saying, well, all right, if we can make money off globalization and we can export our stuff, go on and make money for Chinese benefit. So perhaps I'm being hypocritical here, but I guess the question is as well, to what extent should we have this, I guess, self-propagation mindset to the best of our abilities? And to what extent should we be like, all right, let's try to prevent this cultural assimilation on both sides?
I suppose once we get into a system where dog eats dog, one must be the dog that eats more dogs than any other dog. That's the way to survive. But if you have a system where a dog has dog, and there's another dog, and there's another dog, and they eat each other, I think that's a more purposeful system where we had it built. I think the problem is we've now moved into this globalisation model. So indeed, what is there to do but play the system? I think that's the unfortunate part. It's relatively hard to unglobalize on an international level, but we can certainly, I think, unglobalize our own country. We can produce in-house. We used to produce in-house in country. We used to produce inside our own borders, have a general amount of food production. Perhaps we've lost some of the skill, we need to skill up, but it is possible to return and be more protectionist and be more insular, as perhaps the policies of Woodrow Wilson in his period in America were very isolationist policies. They can be adopted and they can be put in. It is just challenging a leap to take.
I definitely agree with you on that point, and I think in some sense the best defense against foreign policies, and in the same sense I think on an individual best defense against cultural and I guess to develop critical thinking is precisely that idea of I need to become self-sufficient first, and in the same way countries should have that same mindset. Now, I guess to end off this episode, we talk a lot about religion in our previous episodes. Perhaps we could talk about the idea of religious evangelism and religious spread, because that's also one of those elements of globalization which becomes so strong. In the past, perhaps one could make that the first element of globalization was the Christian evangelists going into the middle of South America to try to convert.
I would say it's the first instance, but it certainly did have a large impact. And I suppose it comes, and perhaps it might be an accusation of bias, but I don't see something wrong with a Christian evangelization of the world. It doesn't necessarily destroy culture. It can live alongside a myriad of national cultures, but it's about that which is transcendental, which links us, and ultimately that of salvation. And there is no salvation, after all, outside the church. And there is only salvation through that of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ. And in that sense, it is indeed the Christian duty to spread it. To bring more people to hear the gospel, to have the salvific qualities of Christ put onto them. And so that is on one hand. And I think even if we look across Europe, where perhaps there is one could argue a European culture of some sort, but France has a different culture to Germany, has a different culture to Spain, has a different culture to Britain. But at one point they were all indeed Christian. And to a greater or less extent, they still are, however waning it's starting to become. It can still have a myriad of culture contained within it. Perhaps not a myriad of pagan culture, but a myriad of some form of cultural tradition and respect is held within it. And again, it holds the world eternal truths. So in that sense, I think it should be accepted.
Brilliant. I think that's a wonderful way to end off this podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like and subscribe to stay tuned for more episodes on the Oxford Conservative Podcast. Stay safe, God bless, and I'll see you next one.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Excellent. That wasn't too racist.
No, that was good. I think it was all right. I think
yes.
this is hilarious. I think this is the episode